The man known to history as King Edward I was born at some stage on the night of the 17th of June 1239, or the early hours of the 18th, at the Palace of Westminster, which was then lying on the western outskirts of the City of London. His father was King Henry III of England, a monarch who had ruled the country from childhood, but was only just beginning to exercise some actual authority himself in his early 30s as Edward was born. Henry was an extremely pious religious man who was devoted to the cult of St. Edward the Confessor, and he named his eldest son after the saint. His mother was Eleanor of Provence, a French noblewoman whom his father had married 3 years before Edward was born. Henry and Eleanor's marriage was a happy one in a time when royal weddings were often arranged for political purposes. In the years following Edward's birth, she and Henry would have 4 further children, a boy, Edmund, and 3 girls, Margaret, Beatrice, and Catherine. 3 of Edward's siblings would survive into their adult years, but Catherine died before her 4th birthday. Young Edward was born at a time when England was in the midst of considerable political turmoil. His grandfather, King John, who had ruled England from 1199 to 1216, had been a controversial and, in many ways, a weak ruler. In the early 1200s, he had engaged in a series of disastrous conflicts in France, which resulted in the loss of much of England's extensive territories in the north of the country to King Philip II of France, notably the Duchy of Normandy, which had formed the core of the English presence on the other side of the English Channel. Then, in the mid-1210s, John had faced a revolt by his own English lords, known as the First Barons' War. John initiated some political reforms before his death in 1216 in order to quell the unrest, including the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, of 1215, but the succession of Edward's father when he was just 9 years old ensured that there would be no quick end to England's domestic turmoil. Henry III was a pious and in many ways an honorable ruler, but he was ineffective in some other ways and easily dominated by court factions for much of his long reign. Consequently, Edward's younger years were dominated by unstable politics throughout England, further civil strife, an extensive revolt in Wales, and on the international stage, a failure to recover any of England's former territories in France. Eventually, Edward would be sucked into the civil strife of his father's reign, and he would often find himself in opposition to the king's own government. As was typical for royal children at the time, Edward was raised largely away from his parents in his own royal household. Letters from his father demonstrate a fatherly concern for the young prince, though perhaps not of the kind which would be typical today. In 1242, when he was around 3 years old, Henry expressed a concern that Edward didn't have good wine to drink. In his youth, Edward's care was handed over to Hugh Giffard, and then, in 1246, to Bartholomew Peche, a close friend of the king's. Serious concerns arose concerning Edward's health around this time, and these issues did not fully abate until the early 1250s. The details of how he was educated are unfortunately quite scant, but this was a time when there was a greater emphasis on pursuing martial abilities and other pursuits, such as hunting and jousting, than there was on academic accomplishment for a future king. As a result, Edward would be no scholar king. In the mid-1250s, Edward, who became known as the Lord Edward from a young age, was granted considerable authority over the crown's possessions outside England, specifically Ireland, Gascony, and Wales, each of which afforded him a large income and gave him a certain degree of independence from his father. From 1256, Edward's official seal was being used in Ireland to indicate his senior position there. In 1154, though he was just 14 years of age, Edward was married to Eleanor of Castile, who herself was a year and a bit younger than Edward. The marriage of the pair, who were barely entering their teenage years, was a political act designed to shore up English power in its remaining French territory of Gascony, which lay just to the north of the Kingdom of Castile in Spain. Despite the arranged nature of the marriage, it was a very happy one. Eleanor and Edward were devoted to each other, and she accompanied him everywhere, even years later heading on crusade with him to the Holy Land. A long marriage which lasted over 35 years resulted in many children. It is believed there were 14 in all, though the exact number is not entirely clear at a time when infant mortality and stillbirths were common. These generally arrived in a 20-year period between 1264 and 1284, though only one son, the future King Edward II, survived into adulthood, as did 5 daughters: Eleanor, Joan, Margaret, Mary, and Elizabeth, although Eleanor would die as well before she reached her 30th year. Thus, at least 8 of their children died in infancy or childhood, a rate which, even by the standards of the time, was unusually cruel on Edward and Eleanor. By the late 1250s, Edward was being pulled into the political strife of his father's reign. Numerous issues, including the perception of the king's fiscal recklessness and his excessive support for the French relatives of the Queen at court, combined to force many of the English lords and some of the powerful French faction, led by an influential political figure called Simon de Montfort, to push Henry into making concessions at a parliament held at Oxford in 1258. The so-called Provisions of Oxford saw many of Henry's French councillors expelled from positions of influence, and the government of England was all but handed over to a group of 15 councillors who were selected from amongst the leading magnates and nobles of the realm. Edward's position in all of this was ambiguous, and he did not overly support his father. Indeed, when an even more radical series of measures, known as the Provisions of Westminster, were forced on the king in 1259, the rebellious lords who implemented these had the support of Edward himself. All of this effectively resulted in a drastic reduction in the king's power, while Edward, who had felt stifled by his father in recent years, attained a greater position of authority within this form of conciliar government of the late 1250s. Though often viewed as a weak king, Henry was not willing to acquiesce with this curtailment of his power. He now moved to acquire the aid of the French king, Louis IX, against his own nobles by formally relinquishing English claims to the Duchy of Normandy and other French territories which had effectively been lost to the French over half a century earlier. In return, Louis provided Henry with financial and military support, with which he returned to England in 1260 and began re-establishing his royal authority. By late 1261, de Montfort had been exiled to France, and Edward had reconciled with his father after much jostling. He was briefly sent to Gascony in France, where he stabilized the region, but as the disturbances in England continued, he was recalled. Then, when de Montfort crossed back from France to England in the spring of 1263, a new opposition movement began to emerge at Oxford. By the autumn, armed clashes between the king and his opponents were occurring, and by the winter of 1263, de Montfort's alliance of fractious lords were able to seize control of London. This time, it was decided to put matters to King Louis IX to act as an arbitrator in the dispute. But Louis sided with Henry and proposed the annulment of the earlier provisions that had been agreed at Oxford and Westminster in 1258 and 1259. Given this, de Montfort and his allies chose renewed war, and what is known as the Second Barons' War commenced. Unlike in the late 1250s when the Civil War commenced in 1264, Edward was steadfastly loyal to his father. In April, he played a leading role in the capture of Northampton, where one of Simon de Montfort's sons was gathering a large baronial army. But the war would be won or lost in the south, and early that summer it started to go very badly. At the Battle of Lewes in Sussex, in the southeast of England on the 14th of May 1264, the Royalist forces engaged de Montfort's army. Edward led the cavalry on the right wing of his father's army to good effect, but the battle was lost overall, as de Montfort's forces occupied a strategic position on the high ground of Offham Hill. In its aftermath, Edward was taken as a hostage and placed under confinement, while Henry was forced to make massive concessions to de Montfort. For all of a year, de Montfort was virtually an uncrowned king of England. But when Edward escaped and began building up a royalist force again in the Welsh marches, the tables turned. He was now effectively the head of the royalist cause, as his father remained a prisoner of de Montfort's. Concerted campaigns throughout the summer of 1165 brought much of the north and western England back under crown control, and de Montfort was forced to engage Edward in the field at Evesham on the 4th of August 1265. Here, Edward outmaneuvered de Montfort before the battle, who was placed on the defensive from the offset. The result was a crushing victory for Edward, in the course of which de Montfort was killed, and the king was finally released. Victory at Evesham did not bring the war to an end. Campaigning continued through late 1265 and into 1266, before the last major stronghold, Kenilworth, was placed under siege. Edward briefly joined this action in the summer of 1266. The dictum of Kenilworth was issued in October, which laid out terms whereby those who had been in rebellion would be able to repurchase their lands from the crown. It was hoped by this that the garrison would surrender, but they refused and held out until December. By then, Edward had gone north to deal with further operations to mop up rebels there. A final push was made by the Lords on London early in 1267. It was led by the Earl of Gloucester, and posed a serious threat that the tide of the war could yet again turn. But Edward entered into negotiations with Gloucester, who was effectively bought off. With this, matters began to wind down. A more conciliatory line was taken towards those who were still in arms, which led to the laying down of weapons in many locations. Edward campaigned to the Isle of Ely in the early summer, which was seized with little difficulty, while a final push into the fens in early July saw the last of the rebels surrender. The Second Barons' War was over, and Edward had played a key role in victory for his father's cause. Plans were quickly initiated to reach a political settlement in order to bring the tensions that had caused the Second Barons' War to an end. The result was the Statute of Marlborough, which was issued in November 1267, whereby some of the legal and fiscal reforms that had been desired in the late 1250s, and which Edward had briefly supported, were implemented, this time with royal consent. It is unclear what part Edward played in the debates over these changes. Indeed, it is difficult to determine what his exact role in government was at all in the late 1260s. Disputes arose frequently involving him, one with the Earl of Gloucester, over their overlapping jurisdictions around the town of Bristol. There is some evidence of Edward being involved in royal councils, but certainly not on the scale that one would have assumed would be the case given his prominence in ending the war, though he did receive extensive estates in the land confiscations that followed the conflict. Overall, it had been a mixed political apprenticeship for him. He had gained extensive experience as a military commander and to a lesser extent as an administrator, but Edward had also gained a reputation one which is perhaps overstated at times for being politically manipulative, someone who had been willing to throw in his lot with his father's enemies in the late 1250s, but then changed sides quickly in the early 1260s. Despite his father's increasing old age and infirmity, Edward became determined in the late 1260s to depart on a crusade to the Holy Land. The Crusades had been a central pillar of life in Europe during the High Middle Ages. Beginning in the 1090s, the papacy had begun urging Christendom's monarchs, lords, and knights that it was their solemn duty, as the faithful of God, to try to reclaim the Holy Land, and the city of Jerusalem in particular, from the Muslim heathens there. A first crusade in the final years of the 11th century had proved enormously successful, with Jerusalem and several other cities such as Antioch and Acre captured and 4 Crusader states established. However, in the course of the 12th century, these had declined and Jerusalem was eventually conquered by the Muslim Lord Saladin in 1187. Despite a concerted effort by Edward's great-uncle, King Richard the Lionheart, to reclaim it during the Third Crusade in the early 1190s, the city remained out of Christian hands, and the other Crusader states continued to decline into the 13th century, despite numerous further crusades. Edward's father had long hoped to head on crusade himself, but now Edward took up the mantle for him. In the early 1170s, Edward would head on what was to be the 9th Crusade, but which is typically referred to as Lord Edward's Crusade. Such was his centrality to it. It was preached in response to the threat posed to the remaining Christian presence in the Levant by the Mamluk Sultan Baybars. When the crusade had been called by the Pope, the French king and his sons had agreed to take the cross and travel to the Holy Land. As a consequence, Edward possibly felt duty-bound to do so on behalf of the English royal family, though there is little doubting that he was also an enthusiastic participant. The expedition was funded in part by the Crown, but Edward bore a considerable amount of the expenses through his own household, a not inconsiderable burden. Approximately 225 knights agreed to travel with the prince, and these were complemented by several hundred further troops and auxiliaries. Most of these were royalists who had fought on the Crown's side in the civil conflicts in England of the 1250s and 1260s, and there was a reluctance by many of those lords who had only recently reconciled with the Crown to engage in the royal expedition. As a result of all this, the crusade which set off from England in the summer of 1270 was a decidedly small one by comparison with some of its forebears. Recruitment had been difficult, and even the financing precarious, and based to a considerable extent on a loan of £17,500 from King Louis IX of France, the leader of the much larger French contingent, with plans for some taxes to be raised in England to pay for it retrospectively. Edward's army was traveling behind the much larger French contingent, and when he finally caught up with them in the late autumn of 1270 at Tunis in North Africa, he learned that King Louis IX had died of dysentery some weeks earlier. There, the new leader of the French contingent, Charles of Anjou, entered into a negotiation with the Emir of Tunis, whereby the expedition would be diverted to Sicily in order to see to matters in Italy, where the French had become involved in the south of the country some years earlier. Edward was indignant with this diversion, and instead elected to continue with his small contingent along the original route and headed eastwards as planned, landing at the Crusader stronghold of Acre in the Holy Land in mid-May 1271. The Lord Edward's crusade possibly scored an immediate victory upon his arrival. The Christian port was threatened by the Mamluk leader Baybars at the time, and some of the contemporary sources suggest that Edward's arrival prevented an onslaught on the town. However, The Arab sources are altogether less congratulatory of the English lord on this count. In any event, when Baibars did appear outside the walls of Acre early that summer, with far superior forces than Edward possessed, he could have almost certainly taken the town, had he decided to besiege it. Edward's admittedly meagre forces spent over 6 weeks ensconced at Acre before finally making a foray to St. George de l'Urbain, about 25 kilometers from the town. The piercing summer heat and some food poisoning stalled any efforts to proceed further. A campaign against Kakun, about 65 kilometers from Acre in the early winter, was more successful, and resulted in the defeat of a Muslim force outside the town. That the main citadel could not be taken, and the Crusaders eventually retreated to Acre once again. Ultimately, the issue was that little could be achieved with the very limited resources in men and money available to Edward following the French abandonment of the crusade a year earlier. Accordingly, it was not surprising when Hugh III, the King of Cyprus and titular King of Jerusalem, concluded a truce with Baibars to last 10 years. In the early summer of 1272, Edward was angry at the decision, but the Cypriot king was anxious to take advantage of the willingness of the Mamluk leader to agree such terms, which had become necessary after a large foray by the Mongols into the Levant late in 1271 that temporarily threatened the Mamluk rear had quickly dissipated. Edward remained in the Holy Land until September 1272, during which time he held hopes of perhaps changing Hugh's mind, but the crusade was effectively over. Probably the most notable incident during Edward's time in the Middle East occurred one night in his bedchamber when he was attacked and almost killed by an assassin. It is unclear who ordered his death. Some accounts state it was Baibars, whereas others say it was ordered by a mysterious old man of the mountains who was a leader of a fanatical Islamic sect. During this attempt on his life, Edward was able to fend off and kill his assailant, but was stabbed with a poisoned knife during the struggle. His wife Eleanor, according to accounts, then sucked the poison from the wound, possibly saving her husband's life in the process, and the two then left the Holy Land in September 1272, as it was evident that their lives were in danger, and also that little more could be done to further the Christian cause. Edward set off on the return journey to England in September. He left behind a Crusader presence which was living on borrowed time. In the years that followed, pressure on Acre from the Mamluk and others continued, and Edward, like his contemporary monarchs across Europe, would receive repeated calls for further aid to be sent throughout the 1270s and 1280s. These were not heeded in any substantive way, and finally, in 1291, the Crusader presence in the Holy Land was brought to an end nearly 200 years after it began, when Acre fell to the Mamluks. Back in the autumn of 1272, Edward headed home via southern Italy. He was there by early 1273, where he learned the news that his father had died the previous November, and that he was now King of England. However, despite receiving this information, he did not head hastily for England. Rather, he engaged in a slow journey through Italy and southern France before heading to Paris to pay homage to the new French king, Philip III, who was theoretically Edward's liege lord over his lands in France. Edward then visited those few meager remaining possessions which England held on the continent in Gascony, before finally returning to England in August 1274, by which time the country had been without a king for nearly 2 years. Plans for Edward's coronation had been underway well before his eventual landing in England on the 2nd of August 1274. Consequently, it was possible for the ceremony to be held just over 2 weeks later, on the 19th of August. Disputes invariably arose concerning precedence, with Edward's brother Edmund pushing for him to be given a greater rule, as he had acted as steward of the realm during Edward's absence, while a perennial argument at medieval royal coronations over the seniority of the Archbishops of Canterbury and York saw the latter excluded altogether from the ceremony. Otherwise, things went smoothly, and the celebration took place on a grand scale. An enormous banquet, involving thousands of cows, oxen, pigs, and chickens was to be held, while other staple fare of the medieval and early modern periods, such as swan, cranes, and goats, were prepared. Westminster Abbey was redecorated at considerable expense. When the coronation finally came, it was the first to involve the coronation of both a king and queen of England since the Norman conquest over 200 years earlier. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Robert Kilwardby, placed the crown on Edward's head, which he duly removed, affirming that he would not wear it again until the lands England had lost under his father were reclaimed. Thus did he affirm that it was the beginning of a new age. The man who had just become king is often represented as a dour Machiavellian, but this is not precisely accurate. Standing at 6 foot 2 inches, Edward acquired the name Longshanks on account of his unusual height at a time when few men reached 6 foot. By the time he was crowned, the blonde hair of his youth was beginning to darken, and it would turn grey in his middle years. He spoke with a very slight lisp, but with purpose and persuasively. In religious terms, he was orthodox and made the conventional donations to churches and monasteries, while hardly being possessed of anywhere near the religious devotion of his father. He was probably not well read, but expressed his cultural proclivities through his patronage of architecture and painting, notably supporting Walter of Durham, who did much to decorate the interiors of Westminster Abbey. By disposition, he could be good-natured and amiable, but also prone to violent outbursts. He enjoyed hunting and was a keen supporter of the tying of the Arthurian legend to the English monarchy. Ultimately, though, his administrative abilities were limited in many ways, with very little understanding of the nuances of finance and logistics. But what he lacked in this regard, he more than made up for with his sense of purpose and forcefulness, traits which had been lacking in an English monarch since the days of his great-uncle Richard the Lionheart, over 70 years earlier. One of the first issues that arose for Edward as king back in England came from the west in Wales. The Normans had established a significant amount of control over Wales following their conquest of England in the 11th century, and that had been maintained and even strengthened for much of the 12th century. But the weakened state of the English crown during the reigns of Edward's grandfather and father had seen a succession of rebellions there by the Welsh princes, notably Llywelyn ap Gruffudd, in an attempt to re-establish Wales's independence from England again. However, ap Gruffudd failed to realize that the English crown's position was stronger by the 1270s. Therefore, Edward expected Llywelyn to pay homage to him as his ancestors had done as a matter of course. His grandfather, Llywelyn the Great, for instance, had paid homage to both King John and Henry III in the 1200s and 1210s. Thus, when Llywelyn invaded English territory in the March region, Edward considered it the actions of a rebellious subject and became determined to act against him. He was aided in this by the fact that ap Gruffudd had alienated several of the other Welsh princes who had sought refuge at the English court. Thus, in the summer of 1277, Edward, at the head of a great royal army of 15,000 men, advanced into northern Wales with a fleet in support. No violence was needed. Llywelyn realized that this overwhelming show of force was an indication that his ambitions needed to be tempered, and he came to terms with Edward through the Treaty of Aberconwy, whereby his authority was severely curtailed in Wales and he agreed to pay a huge indemnity of £50,000 to the English crown. Consequently, the homage of the Welsh lords, which had been paid to kings such as Henry II in the 12th century, was quickly re-established under Edward. This certainly did not settle the matter. A new war broke out 5 years later in 1282, and on this occasion Edward faced a combination of the Welsh princes, many of whom had allied with him in 1277, but who were disillusioned at his failure to sufficiently reward them for their aid in the aftermath of that invasion. Llewellyn's brother Dafydd initiated proceedings by attacking Harden Castle in April, which was followed by further attacks on English castles in the region. Edward showed a similar resolve to that which he had demonstrated 5 years earlier. As he perceived it, Llewellyn and the other Welsh lords were not independent princes of a foreign land, but rebels of a country long controlled by England who were refusing to pay proper homage to him as their monarch. This was a mindset which Edward would employ later towards England's northern neighbour as well. A large host was once again assembled and sent into northern Wales to surround the Upgraffodd stronghold in Snowdonia. When Llewellyn subsequently attempted to break out of the encirclement into central Wales, he was killed in action at Irvine Bridge on the 11th of December 1282, while efforts to continue to war by his brother Dafydd were ineffective. Thus, the last Welsh stronghold surrendered in April 1283, just 1 year after the war had commenced. Dafydd ap Gruffudd was handed over to Edward's government shortly thereafter and executed, thus breaking the resistance of the foremost opponents of English intervention in Wales. Victory in 1283 saw one of the most thorough English reductions of Welsh independence ever seen. The Statute of Wales was passed in 1284 and extended English systems of government into Wales. New English-style counties were created and English local government introduced. Many Welsh nobles were disinherited and their lands granted away to English followers of Edward. To cement this new imposition of English rule, a comprehensive program of castle building was also undertaken at sites like Conwy, Carnarvon, and Harlech. New towns quickly emerged at these same sites, and others such as Flint, Aberystwyth, and Fruitland, while efforts were made to Anglicize existing Welsh towns. Yet there were limitations to all of this, and it should not be assumed that Edward I completed the English conquest of Wales. Rebellions broke out in 1287 and again in 1294, the latter requiring a huge injection of English military power. Almost 30,000 men were involved in one fashion or another before the revolt was finally suppressed in the spring of 1295. All in all, the endeavour distracted Edward from issues he was facing elsewhere by the 1290s, and had cost the crown an enormous sum of £55,000 to crush, highlighting how precarious control over Wales would remain for many years to come. The issue of financing such armies as were employed in Wales at various points between the mid-1270s and the mid-1290s was a major concern for an administration that aimed to reassert English power in a substantial fashion on several fronts. A major overhaul of the English finances and government was undertaken as a result to increase the inflow to the exchequer. No sooner had Edward been crowned than he appointed a close ally, Robert Burnell, as Chancellor of the Exchequer. Burnell immediately announced a commission of inquiry into various aspects of the government finances and administration, the primary purpose of which was to identify concealed lands which the Crown had title to, but records of which had been lost. Though the results were mixed, this inquiry did influence the formation of the extensive Statutes of Westminster, which were promulgated in the spring of 1275. This was the first of several acts down to 1290 which sought to end abuses of land tenure and the sub-infeudation of land whereby the lords were robbed of their feudal dues. The rights of tenants were also seen to, while the crown sought to restrict the church and others from granting away lands without royal approval, the better for the crown to receive its own income from such transactions. Overall, this legislation constituted major changes to the crown finances, landholding, and issues of debt in medieval England. While the inquiry of 1274 and the resulting Statutes of Westminster in 1275 began the process of reforming certain elements of landholding and other issues pertaining to the crown, they did not solve the fiscal problem. Additional financial measures were introduced as a result. In 1275, a customs duty of 6 shillings and 8 pence was placed on sacks of wool being exported from England. The English cloth trade at the time was very considerable, and this modest customs duty yielded approximately £10,000 a year into Edward's exchequer, a sum equivalent to tens of millions of pounds today. Added to this was a one-off tax of 1/15 of the value of movable goods, a medieval wealth tax of sorts, which yielded upwards of £80,000. These measures were augmented by reforms to the running of the exchequer, while the church also faced additional taxation from 1279 onwards. That same year, a recoinage was undertaken, a measure that was engaged in for the dual purposes of removing forged coins from circulation and gaining the crown an additional financial windfall in its reissue of new coins. Such measures had to be undertaken regularly in an age when coin value was still based largely on the silver content of the coins in circulation. While these efforts at financial reform were broadly successful, they still did not prove sufficient for Edward's government to meet the cost of its wars over the years. For instance, when unrest arose in Wales again in the early 1280s, it took the crown by surprise, and money had to be raised fast. Initially, the deficit was met by taking loans from the wealthy merchant communities of the towns, totaling over £16,000. When this proved insufficient to meet the military situation, regional assemblies were called for early in 1283 in the north of England and other districts. Italian merchant bankers such as the Riccati family, whose influence as bankers extended across much of Western and Central Europe by the late 13th century, were also turned to. What all of this revealed was that despite how effective the reforms of the 1270s had been, England still could not finance a major war effort for an extended period of time without resorting to extraordinary measures to collect additional money. Consequently, further reforms of the exchequer were undertaken in the 1280s, notably the Statute of Ruthless, which aimed to improve bookkeeping and root out some of the corruption that was endemic in all pre-modern societies. These measures ultimately saw increasing efficiencies in the administrative apparatus of the English state during Edward's reign. All of this legislation and fiscal improvement of the 1270s and 1280s played out against a backdrop of parliamentary reform. Today, the Magna Carta, which was passed in the dying months of King John's reign, is typically seen as the great constitutional event of the High Middle Ages in England. But this is generally overstated. While it ensured some rights to the English nobility in their relationship with the crown, the more significant developments in Parliament, the Legislative Assembly, which would go on to become the mother parliament of modern democracy, actually began to occur during Edward's reign. For instance, it was Edward who oversaw the beginnings of the system whereby parliamentary members were returned down to the modern era. This stipulated that 2 knights were to be returned to Parliament from every county and 2 burgesses from every corporate town, a system which began to implement national representation for the first time. This presaged the constituency system which most modern democracies elect their parliaments according to today. In addition, Edward established a tradition in his first Parliament of 1275 of asking Parliament for permission for extraordinary taxation, a development that was designed to avoid the constitutional conflicts that had dogged his father and grandfather's reigns. In the process, Edward's major contribution to parliamentary developments in England was to establish a reciprocal relationship between crown and country. The crown and government could request taxes, and the country could ask for favors and reforms in return. This system would operate effectively until the 17th century. There were administrative and financial successes elsewhere, though events in Ireland are generally little commented upon in studies of Edward's reign. There were significant developments there during his 40-plus years in power. Much of the country had been first conquered by England in the late 12th century, though some parts of it remained outside of English rule. It was still expanding during Edward's reign, though based largely on the initiative of the English lords there. Two measures are notable, though. A lay subsidy tax was initiated in 1292, and this was used in the years that followed to fund the establishment of a new Irish Parliament with elected representatives, which met officially for the first time in 1297. It would last for over 500 years until the Act of Union subsumed the Irish Parliament into the English Parliament at Westminster. In addition to this, Edward's reign saw a notable strengthening and expansion of the court system in Ireland, which centralized courts in Dublin and regional courts in the provinces, dispensing justice under the common law. As a result of all this, Ireland generated a healthy profit for the English exchequer by the end of Edward's reign, and English political commentators on Ireland of the early modern period would look back from a vantage point of over 250 years and view the early 14th century as the heyday of English rule in Ireland. A further issue which impacted on the finances of Edward's kingdom was the position of the Jewish people. A sizable Jewish population had emerged in England during the late 11th and 12th centuries. As elsewhere in Europe, many Jewish people began working as moneylenders, as this was a profitable endeavor, and the Roman Catholic Church forbade Christians to practice usury, the loaning out of money at extortionate rates. Therefore, by the early 12th century, the Jewish community in England was playing a role in the economic life of the country that was significant, considering their actual numbers. This coincided with a growing anti-Semitism in England. Jews were perceived by medieval Christians as being guilty of deicide, the murder of God, in having called for Jesus' execution. This, combined with the issue of Jewish moneylending and role in the economy, had led to increasing persecution of the country's Jewish community during Edward's father's long reign, notably in extorting heavy sums of money from the country's Jews through extraordinary taxation on them and the application of heavy pressure on the country's Jewish people to convert to Christianity. Edward increased these anti-Semitic policies as soon as he became king. In 1275, the Statute of Jewry was passed, which outlawed Jewish people from practicing usury, relieving many of those who owed money to Jewish moneylenders of their debts, confining the Jewish people into ghettos in certain towns and cities, and forcing those over 7 years of age to wear a yellow badge marking them as Jewish. Taxes specific to all Jews over 12 years of age were also introduced. These extremely punitive measures were only in effect for 15 years, for in 1290 Edward, having determined that many Jewish people continued to act as moneylenders across the country, decided to expel the Jewish population from England altogether. Edward had just returned from a journey to his French possessions in Gascony in the late 1280s and needed to levy additional taxes to pay for the campaign. To make this more acceptable to the nobility and gentry, he included a promise to expel the Jewish community from England, a measure which he duly followed through on in 1290. This carried the additional benefit that Edward was able to confiscate Jewish lands and properties into crown possession and sell them off at a financial windfall. The expulsion was carried out relatively quickly, with perhaps between 2,000 and 3,000 Jewish people exiled from England in the early 1290s, often heading for Eastern Europe, which was much more tolerant of their presence. Some small few remained in England, disguised as Italian bankers. Like each of his predecessors, Edward was concerned with France, though in a different manner to previous kings of England. His father had reached agreements with the French in the 1250s which effectively reconciled the English crown to the loss of the extensive territories in northern France. Above all, the Duchy of Normandy, which King John had lost in the 1200s. As such, there was not the same requirement of Edward to attempt to re-establish English control over Normandy and other areas as had been the case in the early years of Henry's reign. Nevertheless, the English crown retained a considerable presence in France, controlling Gascony in the southwest of France, and this necessarily involved Edward in French affairs. He visited Gascony several times, often in an effort to launch reform campaigns there, and most notably in the late 1280s. This resulted in a major series of reforms that were agreed in 1289 and which sought to regulate the conduct of the senior English officials in Gascony, the seneschal of the region and the constable of the town of Bordeaux. Yet what remained the major problem for Edward in Gascony was that he held the region as a fief of the French monarch, rather than in his own right, a situation which in the 1290s would lead to war. Edward had maintained good relations with King Philip III of France, who had succeeded his father following Louis IX's death at Tunis on his journey to the Holy Land back in 1270. Edward had paid homage to Philip when passing through France on his return home from the Crusades in the mid-1270s, and he paid a visit to Paris again in 1279. Outstanding differences between the two crowns had been resolved on this occasion, leaving Anglo-French relations in a good place. Relations between Edward and the new monarch Philip IV, who succeeded his father in 1285, were also good, which makes the outbreak of war in the 1290s between England and France something of an unusual development. The cause was a localized conflict between England and some French merchant sailors operating of the English Channel. Edward felt his move against these elements in his capacity as King of England was entirely justified. But Philip viewed it as an act of rebellion by Edward as Duke of Aquitaine, the title he bore as Lord of Gascony. Thus, the war which broke out in 1294 was a result of Edward's overlapping jurisdictions as both an equal of the King of France, as King of England, while also being a subject of the King of France, as Duke of Aquitaine. After some military engagements in the English Channel with the French merchant vessels there, Philip summoned Edward to Paris to account for his actions. The English monarch was unwilling to show obeisance to a fellow monarch in this fashion, and so sent his brother Edmund on his behalf. A compromise was reached at this point whereby Edward would hand over some minor fortresses as surety in Gascony, while Edward would marry Philip's sister, Margaret, a woman nearly 40 years his junior. Edward's first wife, Eleanor, had died in 1290 after 36 years of marriage, meaning Edward could marry the French king's sister as a means of resolving the dispute which had arisen in the English Channel. However, the entire arrangement turned out to be a ruse on Philip's part, in order to have the Parlement of Paris vote through the confiscation of the Duchy of Aquitaine from Edward. With the outbreak of outright war, Edward's plans also changed, and he now began to develop ambitions to reacquire some of the territories lost by his grandfather 90 years earlier. Edward's strategy from early on in the war was to develop a major alliance of continental powers against the French. In particular, he sought allies amongst the many principalities of the Low Countries and Western Germany, which in the late medieval period were divided into dozens of small dukedoms, counties, and city-states, and with the powerful Duke of Burgundy, who controlled extensive territories in eastern France. In this way, Edward hoped to build up a power base in the Low Countries around the Duchy of Brabant and the counties of Gueldre and Holland, whereby England would strike into northeastern France towards Paris, rather than operating out of Gascony as the French would suspect. This action was delayed until 1297, by which time the English had encountered mixed fortunes in their clashes with the French in Gascony. In any event, the military campaign in the Low Countries turned into a costly debacle, from which Edward only managed to extricate himself in the spring of 1298. Thus, this strategy proved a consummate failure in the final years of the 13th century, but the idea of building an alliance of European allies and striking against France from the Low Countries was one that would be employed effectively by Edward's grandson against the French many years later. The failure of Edward's Grand Alliance ended the most intense period of the war against France, but it took some considerable time for the war to be brought to a conclusion, even following the negotiation of a truce late in 1297. In 1299, a major step was taken when the previously negotiated marriage between Edward and Philip's sister Margaret finally took place. The couple, who had a 40-year age gap, were married at Canterbury on the 10th of September 1299. Despite the difference in their ages, the marriage was a relatively satisfactory one for both parties, with Margaret bearing Edward 2 sons and a daughter, and she never remarried after Edward passed away several years later. Meanwhile, final peace terms between England and France were finally ironed out in 1303, with a virtual return to the status quo ante bellum. The war had been a costly fiasco for both parties. Military operations in Gascony alone had cost Edward's exchequer approximately £350,000, while over £150,000 was paid in contributions by the English government to the small states of the Low Countries and Germany to win over their aid in the 1290s to almost zero benefit. Such was the massive cost of the war that a formal coronation as queen for Margaret was never held to avoid the expense. This expense in France and the Low Countries was a particular annoyance for Edward, as in the course of the war the primary goal of his foreign policy had switched from France to Scotland. King Alexander III had died there in 1286, leaving his 3-year-old granddaughter, Margaret of Norway, as his heir, but Margaret died in 1290, bringing to an end the direct line of King William the Lion, which had ruled Scotland for over 120 years. There were now over a dozen contenders for the Scottish crown, but the 2 foremost were Robert Bruce, 5th Lord of Annandale, and John Balliol, Lord of Galloway. In order to prevent the country's sliding into civil war, the Council of Guardians, which had been appointed in Scotland to govern during Margaret's youth, appealed to King Edward to act as an arbitrator. Edward now viewed this as an opportunity to re-establish a greater degree of English influence over Scottish affairs. As with Wales, Edward viewed Scotland as a subordinate part of the Kingdom of England, one which England had exercised a significant amount of influence over since the late 11th century, when William the Conqueror and his successor William II had established a degree of Norman control over the northern kingdom. While this had lagged in the course of the century prior to his accession, Edward viewed the succession crisis as a good opportunity to reassert English royal power in Scotland. Accordingly, after he supported the candidacy of John Balliol, who became King John I in 1292, Edward made it clear that he now considered Balliol a vassal who was expected to pay homage to him and Scotland as a quasi-subject kingdom. Balliol and the Scots, however, were unwilling to countenance this, and after war broke out between England and France in 1294, Balliol not only refused to send Scottish troops to aid Edward, but entered into negotiations with the French to form an alliance. This was largely the trigger for Edward's decision to invade and occupy Scotland in 1296. Edward ordered an army to prepare at Newcastle upon Tyne in March 1296. At the same time, he sent envoys north with demands of the Scots that they hand over the border castles of Roxburgh, Jedburgh, and Berwick as surety against any potential alliance they might form with the French. The Scots not only refused this, but a Scottish army led by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, moved south into England against Carlisle Castle on the 26th of March 1296. Here, Edward had appointed Robert Bruce, 6th Lord of Annandale, as governor of Carlisle Castle. It is indicative of how some Scottish lords at the time did indeed view Edward as a sovereign with some considerable rights over Scotland, that they were willing to engage in service to the English monarchy even within England. Bruce's son and namesake would play a major role in the events which would follow over the next 30 years in Anglo-Scottish relations. Comyn failed to seize Carlisle Castle, though his forces did set fire to the town, while further border raids followed by the Scots throughout April. This, however, was as good as military affairs would proceed for the Scottish in 1296. In late March, Edward led his forces across the River Tweed into Scotland. They seized Berwick, at that time the southern outpost of Scotland, within days, and Edward made his headquarters here for some time while he planned his next move as the Scots prepared their forces near Dunbar Castle, a few miles up the coast of Scotland from Berwick. It was here that the early stage of what would become a long 30-year war between England and Scotland would be decided. The Battle of Dunbar was fought between Edward's forces led by John de Warenne, 6th Earl of Surrey, and the Scots, led by John Comyn, Earl of Buchan, on the 27th of April 1296. It appears from the surviving evidence that this was largely a clash between two relatively small cavalry forces consisting of perhaps a few hundred heavy cavalry on both sides. The Scots held a strong position on the high ground, but their lines broke up when they believed that the English were leaving the field. Consequently, an organized English cavalry charge routed the Scots and sent them fleeing. About 100 Scottish lords and knights were taken prisoner. The following day, when Edward appeared in person, Dunbar Castle surrendered. In the aftermath of the battle, several other major castles across lowland Scotland simply surrendered to Edward's invading forces. Edinburgh Castle held out, but also fell after a week-long siege. Thus, a brief campaign had ended in total victory for Edward. King John Balliol surrendered hoping for mercy, but Edward had him stripped of his crown and sent himself to captivity in England. Shortly afterwards, Edward headed south himself with the Stone of Scone, the traditional inauguration stone of Scottish kings, in his train. The importance of this was clear. John was no longer King of Scotland, and the country would have no other king but Edward henceforth. Edward viewed this as the simple culmination of a process that had begun over 200 years earlier, when William the Conqueror and William II had begun asserting a degree of English control over Scotland. In the aftermath of the campaign of 1296, the government of Scotland was largely handed over to Englishmen, with English garrisons established at key locations throughout the country. However, the victory had ultimately been far too easily won, and the back had never really been broken on Scottish resistance. Moreover, As Edward became once again preoccupied with events in France, the opportunity was quickly presented in 1297 for a revolt. This was led by three individuals: Robert Bruce, who would many years later become a king of Scotland himself, was the grandson of Robert Bruce, who had been a contender to the throne back in the early 1290s before Balliol was made king. A second rebel leader was Andrew de Moray, a prominent esquire from northeastern Scotland. The third, and certainly the most famous, was Sir William Wallace. Despite latter depictions of him as a romantic rebel of the commons, Wallace was a member of the lesser nobility of Scotland. Acting independently of each other to begin with, the trio managed to incite popular revolts against English rule across the country, which culminated in a first major victory over English arms at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in September 1297. Moray was fatally wounded at Stirling Bridge, and Wallace was consequently chosen in its aftermath as Guardian of Scotland, a regent of sorts elected by the Scottish nobles in the absence of a Scottish monarch. For the time being, Edward was in no position to retaliate. In 1297, he was busy overseeing the long-planned coordinated action with his erstwhile allies in the Low Countries. Perhaps most significantly, he faced the most serious bout of domestic unrest of his reign within England itself, as the nobility and church leaders expressed several grievances over the cost of the wars in France, Scotland, and Wales, and the lack of proper consultation with them by the monarch. Edward, who was more than aware of the troubles fractious nobles had caused both his father and grandfather, moved swiftly to justify his actions, issuing a long letter in which he apologized for his recent overbearing rule, but arguing that this was needed to bring the wars to a swift conclusion. This did not entirely placate the nobles, who petitioned for an amendment to Magna Carta, the Great Charter which King John had agreed with his nobles in 1215 to enshrine respect of their rights. While this was not granted, there were promises made that the extraordinary requirements being made of the nobility would not be asked of them again. Inadvertently, the revolt in Scotland may have aided his cause, as when the Scots began raiding into northern England in the aftermath of the Battle of Stirling Bridge, it convinced many in England that Edward's pleas for extraordinary taxation and other requests at this time, in light of the emergency, were justified. Edward quickly responded to the incursion of the Scots when he returned to England from Flanders in the spring of 1298. A large army of upwards of 20,000 troops was quickly assembled and led north by Edward, many of them being Welsh infantry, which had been pressed into service to demonstrate their loyalty after the major Welsh revolt of the mid-1290s. They assembled at Roxburgh in late June, and it was from here that Edward proceeded north towards Falkirk. Here, he met Wallace's army in the field on the 22nd of July, 1298. Edward's forces were far numerically superior to the Scots, but the large Welsh contingent was fractious. The Scots numbered some 6,000 men, comprising approximately 4,000 long spearmen, who formed into 4 schiltrons, hedgehog-like phalanxes used to break any charge, including those by heavy cavalry. The gaps between these were then filled by approximately 500 cavalry and over 1,000 archers. These schiltrons had been used to devastating effect at the Battle of Stirling Bridge the previous year, but here they did not prove as effective, because Edward's cavalry was used to circle the Scots, holding their spearmen in place while thousands of Edward's crossbowmen and archers rained down projectiles on them. By the end of the day, both sides had lost upwards of 2,000 men. That for Wallace, whose forces were much smaller than Edward's, this was a devastating blow. Despite his triumph at Falkirk, Edward was unable to capitalize and re-secure control over all of Scotland in the months that followed, restricting his hold to the castles of the border region and southern Scotland. Moreover, developments in France and his marriage to Margaret ensured that Edward was yet again distracted by events elsewhere in 1299, allowing the Scots the opportunity to retake Stirling Castle following a lengthy siege. With the war in France all but over from late 1299 onwards, Edward was able to focus more on Scotland from 1300, but despite annual campaigns into the country, his cause was hampered by Wallace and the other Scottish leaders being unwilling to risk another major defeat, such as had occurred at Falkirk. As a result, Edward was fighting an enemy in the early 1300s that proved unwilling to meet him directly on the field of battle. But victory could be won by duplicity and diplomacy too. Robert Bruce was won over in 1302 to his cause by Edward, while peace in France the following year ended any hope of aid to the Scottish from that theatre. A year later, many of the Scottish lords came to terms with Edward after the English retook Stirling Castle. The Scottish cause was dealt a further blow in the autumn of 1305, when William Wallace was captured near Glasgow by John de Menteith, a Scottish knight loyal to the English crown, and handed over to Edward's government. He was taken to London, where he was hung, drawn and quartered at Smithfield on the 23rd of August 1305. Meanwhile, Edward moved to consolidate his hold over Scotland by appointing his nephew, John of Brittany, son of Edward's sister Beatrice, as Royal Lieutenant of Scotland, while English officials were also installed as Chancellor or Chamberlain within the Scottish government. This process continued down the ranks, with English constables appointed to oversee the border towns and castles, and sheriffs established in the lowland regions as well. The near-total victory, which Edward had once again won, was emphasized in the decision to appoint English judges to some of the positions on the Scottish bench, while a review of the Scottish legal system to streamline it with the English common law was initiated. As with the decision to remove the royal inauguration stone from Scone in 1296, further symbolic gestures were made to emphasize Scottish subjugation, notably the reference around this time in English correspondence to Scotland as land, rather than as a kingdom. Edward's victory in 1305 was to prove as ephemeral as that which he achieved in 1296. At a meeting at Greyfriars Kirk in Dumfries near the Anglo-Scottish border on the 10th of February 1306, between Robert Bruce and Robert Comyn, the only two viable remaining candidates for the Scottish throne, Bruce killed Comyn. The cause of the quarrel was that Comyn attempted to renege on an agreement whereby one of them would relinquish their claim to the throne in return for a grant of lands that would make him the primary magnate in all of Scotland, while the other would become king. When Comyn reneged, Bruce killed him, and 5 weeks later he had himself proclaimed as King of Scotland, ending a 10-year hiatus during which Edward had effectively ruled the northern kingdom with no monarch north of the border. The inauguration was symbolically performed at Scone, the traditional site for the crowning of Scottish kings, despite Edward's seizure of the inauguration stone and bringing of it to England 10 years earlier. Some royal robes were brought out of hiding to solemnize the occasion. As he did so, Robert launched a new rebellion against English rule in Scotland. Bruce's decision to revolt early in 1306 might well have been a propitious move designed to exploit Edward's increasingly poor health. By now, the king was nearing his 70th year, a ripe old age by the standards of the late Middle Ages. Despite his infirmity, a substantial army was nevertheless readied under the command of Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, and Henry Percy, and sent north together with a further force under the command of the Prince of Wales, the future Edward II. In the meantime, Edward became incredibly vindictive following this latest setback in a war he had been trying to win for 10 years, and was determined to demonstrate that he considered this to be a treasonous rebellion by his own subjects, rather than actions occurring in an independent kingdom. As a result, many prominent Scots residing in England were executed in the course of the summer and autumn of 1306 for having tenuous links to Bruce, while others were imprisoned in cages on public display at some of the border fortresses in southern Scotland, a highly unusual punishment for the time. The initial campaign did not proceed well for Bruce. Having advanced into Scotland, de Valence parleyed with Bruce at Methven in mid-June 1306, with their forces on the field. It being late in the day, both sides agreed to wait to do battle until the next day, but as Bruce's forces bivouacked several miles away that evening, de Valence's forces fell on the Scots, in a highly dishonorable breach of the English commander's word. Heavy losses were sustained and Bruce only barely managed to fight his way out of the slaughter. Then on the 13th of September the Prince of Wales captured Kildrammy Castle from the Scots, taking Bruce's brother Nigel captive and several other senior supporters of the Scottish king. One of these, Sir Simon Fraser, was taken to London and executed despite having been a former courtier at the English court. This was in keeping with Edward's policy of showing no mercy towards any supporters of Bruce's cause throughout 1306. The king himself remained in no fit state health-wise to command on the field, and despite Bruce's campaign being at a low ebb in the autumn and winter of 1306, matters began to turn early in 1307. Bruce spent the winter either in the Hebrides of western Scotland or the Orkneys, building up his support in the Gaeltacht of Scotland while possibly also visiting Ireland. Reinforced, he returned to the Scottish mainland early in the spring of 1307 and began a guerrilla war in southwestern Scotland. Ominous signs that Edward would not be able to reverse the situation again in Scotland were seen in April 1307, when Bruce first won a small victory over de Valence's men at the Battle of Glentrool, and then a much more decisive win at the Battle of Loudon Hill in Ayrshire. Here de Valence led as many as 3,000 men against a force of under 1,000 Scots led by Bruce, but the Scots utilized the terrain effectively to nullify de Valence's numerical superiority. Spearmen were used to the same effect as at Stirling Bridge years earlier to gain a major victory for Bruce over the English. Edward was apparently furious with these new reversals, which signified an end to the possibility of any quick overcoming of the fresh unrest in Scotland. This was the context in which King Edward I's life came to an end. Several weeks after the loss at Loudon Hill, he reviewed some of the English troops amassed at Carlisle Castle near the border, before finally proceeding north towards Scotland. Despite his poor health, his condition immediately deteriorated as he contracted dysentery, and while camped at Burr by Sands just south of the Scottish border on the morning of the 7th of July 1307, Edward Longshanks died. A tradition holds that Edward's deathbed wish was that his heart be carried to the Holy Land as part of a new crusade, which the king had always had ambitions to launch, but had never found the time propitious to do so. He would have died that summer morning, in his 68th year, believing that much of his life's work was at least incomplete and perhaps heading towards failure, as Scotland had recently acquired its first king after a 10-year hiatus, and Bruce had won several victories on the field of battle against Edward's forces. Moreover, it must have been clear to him that no matter how often he sent large armies into Scotland and established a seeming control over the country, it always ended up in rebellion within months. He was succeeded by his son, Edward, Prince of Wales, with whom ominous signs of his reign being dominated by powerful favourites had already emerged. After a few further months of campaigning in Scotland, Edward headed south and was crowned king in February 1308. Edward's death ushered in a period of political, social and economic crisis in England. His son's 20-year reign was chaotic, with Edward II favouring a range of political favourites who aroused the enmity of the wider political community of England. This was compounded in the mid-1310s when a run of very poor weather struck Europe. In 1314, this led to nearly 150 days of continuous rain, followed by widespread harvest failures, which led to one of the most catastrophic famines in the continent's history. Simultaneously, an outbreak of a very virulent form of cattle disease occurred which saw livestock numbers plummet. Tens of thousands died across England as a result of these events, and while Edward II's successor in 1327, Edward III, proved a far more capable.
If you find this video interesting and useful, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell to stay updated with the latest videos.